The Reaper by Dorothy Easton. Millgate was a rich farmer, owning his own machines, not like those poorer, smaller men who hired an engine from a neighbor. He has his reaping machine, a red and yellow Walter Wood Cleveland brand. Every morning now, as soon as it's dry enough, about 9 o'clock, the engine starts, and from the farmer's manor house, its heavy, drowsy sounds are heard. For those on the machine, the noise is harder. The only human sound that penetrates it is the old conductor's "Ahoy!" to the driver if the canvas sticks, or if weeds are making a block. Then the young man in front slows his engine down and wipes his forehead with his hand. Reaping goes on until 9 at night. No strange man sits on the reaper, but one of Millgate's best men, the most trustworthy, the most faithful, the wagoner. A man well over 60, with side whiskers, gray eyes, a long nose, and a forehead and chin carved out of granite. On his head a flat, wide-awake hat. On his bent back a white jacket. When he speaks, his mouth moves sideways first. There's always a spot of dried blood on his lip. When he smiles, a tooth stump appears like an ancient fossil. He talks slowly, stopping to spit now and then. Every day of his life, he gets up at 3:30. Now, mounted on the high iron seat, a crumpled sack for a saddle, he rides like some old charioteer, a Hercules with great bowed back, head jutting out, chin straight, a hard, weathered look about his face, and in his heart, disgust. This year, for the first time, they are using a motor engine to pull the reaper around instead of horses. He lived for his horses. He's the wagoner, and they are his job. If one falls ill, he sleeps with it. He believes in horses, but speaking of the motor, he says, "She's all right when she's all right," with a look that ends the sentence for him. In his youth, he had reaped with a scythe. This Walter Wood is a neat arrangement, you can't deny that. One bit of the mechanism works as a divider, while a big, light kind of wooden windmill arrangement, continually revolving, beats the corn down into a flat pan from which it's carried on a canvas slide, up an incline, then shot over and down the other side in a continual, long, flat stream, like yellow matting. And then the needle, the threadle as he calls it, nips in somewhere, binding the flat masses into separate, neat, round sheaves, pitched out every few moments with perfect precision by a 3-pronged iron fork. Above the one big, heavy central wheel, the charioteer is shaken and jolted from 9 till 9. In front, on another iron seat by the box-like engine, the driver works. Behind runs a red-faced laborer, clearing corners. The motor has to run out the full length of its cogged iron wheel bands before it can turn, and the sheaves, dropped on the last round, get in the way, so at every corner they have to be lifted and set back. The laborer clears, then runs after the machine, now halfway up the field, stops at the next corner, stoops once more to lift and shift 3 sheaves, then runs again. This laborer was a man of 40, with a face as naive as a boy of 15. Though getting bald, his eyes were young, his mouth loose, untrained as a child's. He's touched, as we say, and had never really grown up. He slept in the attic, ate in the kitchen, and worked, but was not responsible. He was always given light jobs, walking with the clappers, weeding, cleaning sties, clearing. His greatest friend was a boy of 12. On Sundays, they'd laugh for an hour at nothing. Going to the coast for the first time last year, he was so taken by a Punch and Judy show that he never saw the sea. His smile was the most ridiculous thing in the world. He blushed continually, panted, grinned like some boy caught kissing, and was always apologetic. Lightning made him hide his head, and he was afraid of engines. Their regularity upset him. Running behind the Reaper, this quick-moving, noisy thing smelling of oil, made up of sliding chains, appalled him. There were 5 wheels at an angle, and all the time an oil-wet, black, flat chain band ran around over them. Underneath, the heavy central wheel ran round and round. To the imbecile, the wagoner's courage appeared supernatural. There should have been another man to take 2 corners, but all hands were wanted, so the laborer had to run all day. It was hot, no wind, no shade. If he looked up for a moment, the hills and distant elms appeared bright blue. The big field itself was ablaze with color: wheat like brown burnt amber, poppies, small white daisies, thistles. When the engines stopped, the only sounds were plaintive, anxious bird calls from the center of the field. Sometimes a rabbit or hare looked out, then bolted back. Once 5 graceful, sleek brown pheasants ran out toward the hedge, then lost their nerve, turned, and went running back. The sun shone steadily. Sheaves picked up by the laborer made his hands smell oily. Their string band raised a blister on his forefinger. Very often he grabbed hold of nettles and sharp thistles, and the backs of his hands were swollen and covered with stings. Blue butterflies twirled in front of his face. Pale moths flew out. When his hat fell off, he had no time to get it. The sweat ran down his egg-shaped forehead to his long, square, hairy chin. Though he could shave himself on Sundays, he looked a little like a monkey. When the engine stuck, the wagoner asked in his slow, flat voice, "Won't she speak?" "She's not coming out," was the youth's reply. Once the driver was thrown up a foot when the motor went over a hole. He yelled, "Men are often killed by the Reaper." The imbecile got the startled look of a child seeing snakes at the zoo. Each time the engine snorted, or the wagoner called out, "Ahoy!" a spurt of water ran down his spine. The blood was beating in his head. The sun shone mercilessly on his pale, bald patch. The field began to bounce before his eyes, bloodshot from stooping. When the yards of bindweed shackled the machinery, the wagoner just turned his head, a sign for the laborer, who had to run, had to catch and tear away the long green chains full of small pink flowers. By 4 o'clock they were overtaking him before he got round. The driver had to turn more sharply. The canvas stuck. "Don't you do that again," the old wagoner scolded with stern eye. "You'll turn us over." The engine stuck when they tried to start it again. For half an hour the young driver tinkered with the tools from the box, unscrewing small, oily nuts, testing wires, feeling levers, and in desperation wiped his black, dripping hands on his hair. 20 times he turned the starting handle, but she wouldn't speak. Then suddenly, with a sound like a pistol shot, the engine fired. The machine ran backward, upsetting the laborer, and before he could move, the central wheel ran over his ankles. When the imbecile came to himself, they were still at the corner. His feet were tied up in a jacket. He was suffering horribly, yet seemed unable to focus it. But seeing the red and yellow Reaper standing close beside his head, some memory soaked his face with sweat. He fainted. Brandy was fetched. They lifted him onto a hurdle when he recovered again. The whole group were still at the corner. His employer stood there, stout, well-dressed, and anxious, in his gray felt hat, dark coat and trousers. The driver stood there too, and the old wagoner. Corn was still up in the middle of the field. The laborer looked surprised at seeing sky before him. As a rule, when he started, he saw fields. He turned his face. The men watching saw his round, boyish eyes project at sight of something red and wet and sticky, like the mess they made out sheep killing, splashing on the stubble, while two broken boots lay oozing the same stuff in a large pool of it. Following this look, the old wagoner said slowly, My boy, them are yours." Tears were running down his stiff, dry cheeks. "How do you feel?" asked the farmer. His laborer blushed, then whispered to the wagoner, "What's happening, Mr. Collard?" "Why, you've lost your feet." For yet another minute the imbecile lay panting, shy, self-conscious, under his master's eye, until the idea struck him. Once more whispering to the wagoner, he said, "Help me up. I'll go home, Willie." "You can't walk," said the old man simply. "You can't walk no more." The black hairs stiffened suddenly on the idiot's chin. He had understood that in those bleeding, mangled boots his feet were lying. He began to cry, and then, catching sight of his master, smiled as though to apologize. The end of The Reaper by Dorothy Easton.